Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Justin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oregon. I'm going to talk a bit today about a topic which combines a couple of my favorite things, maybe some of yours as well, park maps. So the basic question which I'll touch on is, how does the information conveyed in park maps or park map brochures influence visitors' travel decisions? So about where and when to visit, what to do, and also the expectations they have for their experience. So those two different things. So I'll give you an example at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone National Park. Just curious who all has been there? Yeah, great. This is a great crowd. So the reason that you would go to a place like this, the star of the show, is the spectacular natural scenery, the canyon. But there are some other considerations to your experience. So how do you access it? How do you get there? There parking lots, roads, and then you get on a trail. So this photo is showing a parking lot with a short accessible trail. Maybe you want to know about the facilities. Where are the restrooms or a place to get some food? And so the built environment, in addition to the natural environment, is an important consideration. And the third thing that this is showing is there's a lot of people there, and this is pretty typical that the social environment is an increasingly important part of your experience in these places. And so if you think about the categories of information that you might want conveyed in, for example, a park map, but also any other information sources, you can think about those three different categories: the natural environment, built, and social environment. And then I'll add a fourth that's not so much, doesn't have a physical presence so much, but rules and regulations, so about how you ought to behave, stay on the trails, and then open hours and fees. That's also good information that you might want to have. And so we'll look at this example here, the brochure for the canyon area, and see what we have. So the river and the canyon are featured pretty prominently. The location of the two waterfalls, maybe you decide to hike out to some of those ponds, and so there's some good information there on the natural environment. The built environment, there's the visitor center. Maybe that's a good place to start your day. There's roads that lead to parking areas where you get out onto a trail, out to a viewpoint, and then when the other nature calls, so to speak, you know where to find a restroom. So there's some good information on the built environment. And there's even a rule here that says, stay on the boardwalks and trails or you might die, is what that says. But what about the social environment? There's not much, if anything, on the map itself. Over there, it says Artist Point is one of the most photographed. So that kind of tells you something, that a lot of people like it. So maybe it's good, but then that also might mean that a lot of people go there, so maybe it's potentially crowded. So that is kind of getting there, but there's not a whole lot of information here, and that's pretty typical. And so what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is how might we convey social information, and what might that mean. And so this is an example from a project we're working on in the infographics lab at the university, the forthcoming second edition of the Atlas of Yellowstone. And what this map is showing is that it's that same canyon area, and it's Flickr photographs. So there's like 5,000 geolocated photographs, and we generated some hot spots from it. And indeed, you do see that Artist Point is, is definitely the biggest hot spot, and you can kind of make some nice spatial comparisons, and you even see some clustering out by those lakes. And so here's an example of some social information displayed spatially, and then you can look to the right to the two graphs for temporal information. So that first graph is showing between about 12 and 4 or 5 o'clock is the high time, and so if you want to kind of beat the crowds, you can get there before or after that. So that's some potentially useful temporal information. And this might look familiar if you've seen what Google does, but what's interesting is that they actually show live information. And so you can see what the conditions are now relative to what it typically is. So this says live, not too busy right now. So maybe that's a good time to go to Artist Point. And the other thing on this page, not to be overlooked, is the photos show the viewpoint itself instead of what you might typically see where it's just the view with all this other stuff cropped out. And so what's nice about photographs like this is it includes that information and gives you a much better sense of what it's actually like to be there. And you can zoom out and make some park-wide comparisons. So there's Canyon again. And maybe you can compare that to the Mammoth area, which has a comparable amount of photographs in that area. If you've been to Mammoth, you may know why there's such a clustering of photographs around the visitor center. This is just kind of an interesting aside. My theory, anyway, is that they irrigate the lawn there. So that's where the elk like to hang out. So there's kind of an interesting clustering there. You can compare it to Upper Geyser Basin, which is where Old Faithful is. And so there's considerable more, in this case, photographs in that area, and a lot of that is due to a heavy clustering around Old Faithful. And what's interesting on the graph on this one, again, the first graph, is it shows a longer period of time where people are staying in this area. There's not so much of a dead period in the early part of the day or the evening. And so, this information, maybe it can be conveyed, and in this case, graphically, and I'm going to talk a bit more about text descriptions in a bit. But the question is, why do we care to convey this information? Why does it matter? And I'd say that I'll give you an example here from a different park, Smith Rock State Park, a little bit closer to home for us, where they have a report that shows that 83% of all park visitors felt crowded at the park. That is just a stunning number to me, 83%. But what the report also shows is that people are getting information. So 35% are using the map brochure. I would have thought that would be a little bit higher, but 70% are using the website. And so people are getting information. And so if we're able to convey social information, I think one of two things can happen, where it could redistribute use to places or times that are less busy, and so it could influence where and when people visit. Or you decide I have the weekend off in the middle of summer and I want to go to Smith Rock, so that's just when I'm going. But now you have an expectation that you might have to wait a few minutes for a parking spot to open up. You're going to see a lot of people on the trail. And so just by preparing your expectations, the research shows that if you expect to feel crowded, you're going to actually feel less crowded. So when your expectations kind of meet your experience, you're going to have a better experience. And so I think by either of those two ways, either redistributing use or kind of adjusting your expectation, that 83 number I think could be driven down. And so it's useful for park management, and it's useful for you as a park visitor to have a better experience. And so what I want to talk about with this example is kind of exactly how do you convey the information. So we looked at some graphic examples, and so this is just using text descriptions. And so I saw all these headlines popping, or a lot of these words in these headlines popping up, like crowded or empty, popular, lesser used, least visited. They're all kind of getting at a similar thing, but they have a different feel. And so what I wondered is, what do these words mean to people? How is it framing the sites? And so I asked them in an online distributed survey, just without any other information, what do you prefer? A place that is more popular, less popular, heavily visited, lightly visited, lesser known, well known, crowded, uncrowded, and so on. And got what I think are some pretty interesting results. And so the first thing I'll point out is I split the respondents into two different groups. And this was based on a separate question that got at how important is it for you to avoid the potential for crowding relative to other, aspects of your experience. And so there's a crowd tolerant group and a crowd averse group. And so the crowd tolerant group in the lighter shade, in the gray, they kind of are less affected by these terms, so they hover around that middle dashed line, which I think makes some sense. And but there's a couple terms, popular, famous, well-known, that they're attracted to. They would prefer to go to those kind of places. And so you look at the crowd averse group, which is the darker black color, and they're much more affected by these terms, which makes some sense. They do not want to go to places that are crowded or much used or congested. They want to avoid those places. But what's interesting is they also prefer places that are popular or famous and to an extent well known. And so what's kind of going on here? So I have some hypotheses to be tested in further research that draws from psychology. So there's this concept of affect in psychology, that you have kind of an emotional response where these terms are kind of framing either a positive or negative emotions, or where popularity on the one side is conveying as a positive affect. It's conveying desirable conditions. A lot of people go there and want to go there, so it must be good, kind of thing. And on the other side, you have crowding, which also kind of says that a lot of people go there, and so it must be good, but it's actually not conveying those positive aspects. It's conveying the negative, undesirable conditions from too many people being there. And then some of the other terms were more kind of neutral, that maybe they're still conveying some good information, but they're not framing things in such a positive or negative way. And so with this, the implications of this is that it's going to have, depending on how you frame the site, either through graphical information or, in this case, text descriptions, it's going to make visitors more or less likely to visit. And so it's going to influence their trip planning decisions. And then again, it could also influence their expectations, where if you're conveying, very positive conditions, they may not have the expectation of crowding. But on the other hand, if you're conveying more of the negative side, crowding for somebody is not crowding for another person. And so it's kind of, you got to be careful there. And so in summary, I guess the information, I think, could be conveyed, but we have to be kind of careful about how we go about it. And so I think if we have a couple minutes for questions, that's it.
All right. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.